Please join me in welcoming our VIP guest as today's lunch speaker, Minister for Education, Ong Ye Kung.
Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan, Chairman of MEI, distinguished guests, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please continue eating. Just not too loud. It is my pleasure to join everyone here today. When I first received the invitation from Bilahari to attend the conference, I thought you sent to the wrong minister. I'm neither involved or an expert in foreign affairs nor the Middle East. But I figured MEI is part of NUS, which is sort of under MOE, so maybe that's why. Yeah. So thank you very much. Most kind of you. But now having to deliver a speech on foreign affairs, I begin to figure out what is the parallel between education and foreign affairs. And I think there are actually amazing parallels. And I realized that some of the most essential foreign policy principles that I've learned over the years, actually I learned them in school, not in the civil service. Let me explain. I attended a kindergarten, Outram, along Outram Road. And that was part of a primary school. So my classmates and I, we were naturally the smallest pupils in the whole school. They might be primary school students, but when you look at the P6s, they are huge. They're huge from our tiny perspectives. And we all have to share a playground during recess time. And so I remember an incident that very vivid. I was hit on the nose by a big boy during one of our games. But fortunately, other than that incident, most of the time we played and coexisted peacefully with one another, despite our disparate physical sizes. On hindsight, that was possible because there were strict school rules that was adhered to. The teachers were always watching, and those times teachers can use canes. Yeah. So years later, after I graduated, I joined the civil service. When I joined civil service, Bilahari was Director D1 then, Director D1. And he said small countries need international rules to survive. I understood immediately, my second lesson in foreign affairs, that was in secondary school. Students, they like, especially secondary school students, they like to hang out in groups. I avoid the word gangs, but there are groups. Amongst them, some groups are led by what we deem as alpha males, the big, tall people. They have sizable followings and sidekicks, and they form quite big groups. Yeah, you have experience there, I'm sure. Yeah. Most of them, I must say, they hang out to play football, they play basketball, or just fool around, But there were always a few groups in every school compound that were a bit more intimidating. And those groups, sometimes, they get on each other's nerves as well. But my friends and I, we were not quite affected because we were not part of them. We belonged to the larger non-aligned movement. But it helped because there were many activities in schools, lessons, CCA, school gatherings, camps, outings, where natural groupings were broken up. And when they broke up, we mingle and have activities together. And so you get a chance to get to know members of these groups, sometimes the alpha males themselves. And so when I became active years later in the APEC circuit, and was part of the effort to prevent the formation of trading blocs that split along the Pacific, and to continue to promote the need for common platforms to encourage interactions between different blocs. That wasn't a difficult concept for me to understand either. Exclusive blocs, they set the preconditions for conflict, and we must always build bridges across oceans, across continents. There's a corollary to this lesson, which is that students willingly, they come out of their comfort zones to participate in various lessons and school activities because the the settings are always orderly and non-threatening. Today, many schools organize football tournaments during school holidays, and during school holidays, there are many restless secondary school kids, and they go home, they are very restless, but you organize these football tournaments and you draw them out from their homes to participate, and they participated with gusto. And they do that partly because they like football, but also because they trust the tournament rules, they trust the teachers who organize it, they also trust the referees. So that essentially is the role of ASEAN. Neutral, non-threatening, a central arena where countries, including big powers, can engage each other. So ASEAN remains central to Singapore's foreign policy. It's far from perfect, but one of the reasons that the Middle East is saddled with conflict is the absence of such an inclusive regional architecture. That was the situation in Southeast Asia in the 1960s and early 70s, when we were then called the Balkan of Asia. ASEAN has managed to contain those conflicts ever since. Finally, notwithstanding all I have said, the most important lesson in foreign affairs as well as in school is that a student's well-being ultimately depends on himself or herself. And that is not a function of size. If you do your schoolwork well, you hand up your homework on time, you are a helpful kid to the rest of your classmates, chances are the teacher will know you, will keep an eye on you, and your friends will watch your back. In sports too, doesn't mean the bigger students will always perform better, because the big kids can do javelin, can do shot put, the slimmer kids can run 10 kilometers, still cannot win, run 20 until you win. In volleyball, the tall ones can be hitters, the tinier ones can be liberals, because they get to the ball quicker. So similarly, foreign policy begins at home. Ultimately, it is about how our country is run, how cohesive our society is, and what value we can bring to the world. We are determined to make a small island state in Southeast Asia, straddling across important trading routes and sea lanes, relevant and important to the world. So I've drawn some tenuous parallels between foreign policy and my current work in education, but I think it's not without logic. For state actors ultimately act on the will of humans. The same social instincts of humans are displayed in many contexts, whether it's school, in our offices, or on the global stage. Government policies will stand better the test of time if they are grounded on the deeper understanding of human behavior and instincts. It reminds me of a Chinese saying. This is written during Qing Dynasty. It goes in Chinese like this: 能攻心则反则治销，治古治兵不好战. Simple translation is that we can dissolve the aggression of our enemy if we know his motivation and his psychology at a deep level. For a wise army never liked war. So a preference for strong international rules, building bridges across continents and cultures, ASEAN centrality, foreign policy begins at home. These are evergreen principles that have stood the test of time. For the rest of the speech, let me talk about three major long-term trends that can make managing of foreign relations more challenging. Number one, the trajectory of US-China relations. Now, this is the most important bilateral relations in the world, and the global community has a stake in it. It is all too easy to be pessimistic about these vital bilateral relations. But too much pessimism is as bad as naive optimism. I can give you two reasons to believe that the US-China war is unlikely, and they may eventually work out a new modus vivendi between themselves. One is the unprecedented level of interdependency between the two powers in trade, investment, finance, currency, people, tourism. I do not think that any two major powers in history had the same level of interdependency and stakes in each other's well-being. You can ride on popular sentiments to enter a trade war, But very soon, prices in supermarkets go up, businessmen find that export businesses disappear, then reality hits. And governments will find it difficult to justify sustaining such a self-flogging campaign. This interdependency was brought about by a post-World War II global order that enables countries to develop deep economic and people-to-people relations in a peaceful and win-win manner. This condition was not present until recent times. The second reason. While global powers will inevitably engage in intensive competition, even fierce competition, history may judge US and China, on the whole, benign powers, with no fundamentally irreconcilable conflict of interest which characterize US-Soviet relations. After World War II, the US played an instrumental role in maintaining global order and regional stability around the world. Today's international order is a construct led by the US. In this process, the US opened up its markets and investments and engaged in security cooperation with various regions in the world. During the 1970s, it held the line in Vietnam and prevented communism from spreading throughout Southeast Asia and Singapore from becoming a Cuba of the East. As for China, whenever she opened herself out to the world, trade across the Indian Ocean and South China Sea flourished, and Southeast Asia benefited from it. 40 years ago, China made the monumental decision to embark on reform and opening up. This in turn resulted in its decision to negotiate entry into WTO, which it succeeded in doing so in 2001. I was in Doha during the ceremony, and I still remember the joyous atmosphere when it was announced that China successfully joined the WTO. Since then, it has lifted hundreds of millions of its people out of poverty in the process of reform and opening up. In other words, China has concluded that it shall be part of the international order shaped by the US, and it is doing so in its own interest. Technology may well be the centerpiece of contests between powers in years to come, and there has to be peaceful platforms for both sides to work out such issues. The relations between the US and China can be fundamentally constructive and positive. They will eventually reach a new modus vivendi in East Asia. The crucial question is whether this will extend to West Asia or the Middle East. Now, let me move on to the second trend, and that is the need for economic transformation. It is an imperative driven by advancements in technology and has to be confronted by governments around the world. But let me focus my comments here on the Middle East, which is most impacted by the fast-changing global energy consumption mix. Fossil fuels, I believe, it will continue to be a major source of energy in the foreseeable future. But the long-term trend, I think, will be a shift away from oil. A driving force is climate change. You can deny it or dispute the science, but eventually you feel the effects in ways that cannot be denied. This is already happening and has generated a certain sense of urgency, leading to countries pledging action through the Paris Accord. In the coming years, we should expect greater investments in renewable energy, with costs continuing to come down. Renewable energy will be an increasingly viable alternative to oil and gas and to fossil fuels. The problem of intermittency still has to be dealt with, but the rise of renewable energy will likely accelerate and gather momentum. Perhaps the more significant factor affecting oil-producing Middle East countries is the energy revolution happening in the US. The regulatory and legal environment enabled US industries to extract oil and gas from deep rock formations through fracking. Fracking is not a very deep technology, but it's really the legal and regulatory environment in the US that allow it to happen. Productivity improvements have made production costs more and more competitive. So even when oil prices was at $45 per barrel, oil fields throughout the US, Permian, Eagle Ford, and many other basins, they continue to flow. Oil production in the US has gone up from about 5 million barrels per day to about 10 million barrels per day now over the last 5-6 years, making US a net exporter of crude and finished products in 75 years. Production is projected to increase to 14 million per barrel per day by 2020, surpassing that of Russia and Saudi Arabia. The economics of producing unconventional oil and gas is a peculiar one. It's different from the others. It's more like manufacturing. Small upfront investment, fast time to market, limited production cycle, making the US a very agile producer. That means it can cut back when prices are depressed and increase production when prices are high. This also means the US is progressively becoming the swing producer, which can influence global oil prices. This shift from fossil fuels to renewables and the increasing influence of the US as a swing producer will change the way the US defines its interests in the Middle East. It is not likely to lead to the US withdrawing from the Middle East, that is naive, but the manner in which the US engages the region is already being calibrated. This will in turn affect the first factor of US-China relations and shift the global dependency on Middle East oil. And shifts in the global dependence on Middle East oil must have profound geopolitical implications for the region. Many Middle East countries are trying to reduce economic dependence on oil and gas, probably in recognition of these trends. And they are seeking alternate engines of growth. They are pursuing economic reforms, diversifying their economies, developing the services sector, focusing on educating the young, empowering women. But economic transformation is always a difficult and daunting process. Today, amongst the Middle East cities, Dubai is probably the most bustling, an aviation center, a magnet for tourists. Dubai started its transformation early because it had almost run out of oil. Let me talk about the last trend. It is about the evolution of politics. Politics, I think, has changed in recent years. And I believe this is also brought about by technology. Just as radio and television have changed politics and elections, the internet and social media are disrupting them even more. One of its earliest upheavals is the Arab Spring, mobilized through social media almost a decade ago. That phase eventually fizzled out, but the march of technology is relentless, and I do not think that we have seen the end of the story yet. It will not just be a matter of mobilizing protesters or online campaigning, nor will it inevitably lead to democracy breaking out everywhere as some thought a decade ago. More profound changes to politics are happening because social media has fundamentally altered the way people receive information, communicate with one another, socialize, and coalesce. I think democracy is most healthy when it is a contest of big ideas about the future and firmly held beliefs and values and conviction of political leaders. Then people vote for the best leaders and ideas and future plans. The results are respected. The losers take a step back and compromise. Society unites and then move forward. That is ideal democracy. But today the system is turning out somewhat differently. Ironically, in the internet era, voters are bombarded with excessive information of varying accuracies and are not sure if they are getting the right information to make informed decisions in an election or referendum. Personality has become as important, perhaps more important, than capability. We have seen how political bickering continues even after the dust of contested elections has settled. The imminent possibility of foreign interference in domestic politics makes things worse. How election issues are defined has also changed. The internet freely shares the lived experiences of citizens and connects them. A voter today may still belong to a large political segment defined by ethnicity, gender, age, or education level, but he is also very likely to take on multiple identities and causes at a nano-political level. And the narrow interests of such small groups can somehow go viral and be amplified. to dominate the national agenda. This is the process by which society divides itself into even smaller tribes, defined by minute commonalities. This affects every country, regardless of the specific form of their political system. Political parties will behave differently too. Campaign managers, now you got big data at your disposal. You can use big data to slice and dice your voter base into tiny segments. In extremists, they can send political messages customized for the individual voter. The result is an explosion of issues, causes, and interests. When we observe elections around the world, politics is at the risk of becoming more like a round-the-clock competition in public relations as opposed to a contest of big ideas for the future. An unending cycle of assertion and pushbacks, a divisive rather than a unifying force. And in physics, we know that Newton's laws break down once we go to a quantum level. At the quantum level, it's like Alice in Wonderland. Particles can appear at two places at the same time. They get entangled together, they fly through each other. So when technology shrinks politics to that nano level, or even smaller, we can imagine democracy starting to break down too. We must all hope that democracy continues to work well. It is imperfect, but it is still the best system known to mankind. If for some reason it can no longer unite societies and show a clear path forward for countries, then foreign policies will suffer too, because foreign policy begins at home. I've spoken on three trends which I think have profound implications for every country in the long term, regardless of their political systems. It is not yet entirely clear how they will affect the Middle East, but we can be sure that there will be some sort of impact. And it is not too early to start thinking it and think through the different scenarios. The conclusion will likely be that we need fresh and bold solutions. Yet, the more complex and uncertain the challenges are, the more we need to stay true to the basic principles I learned growing up in school and talked about in the earlier part of my speech. So I hope institutions such as the MEI will continue to work with the larger host universities, government agencies, and partners to help us think about these long-term issues deeply, help us understand the world better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Ong. I now invite our chairman to join Minister Ong on stage for our question and answer session.
Minister Ong has been very kind to spend some time with us, and again, I want to give as many people a chance to ask questions. So please keep your questions succinct and make sure they are questions, not speeches disguised as questions. And I will exercise the moderator's privilege to begin by asking you the same question I asked Mr. Chan Chun Sing this morning. Now, both of you in ways explain why the Middle East is important to East Asia and Southeast Asia. But I would like you to speak directly to Singaporeans, not this international audience. And if in one sentence you could say why the Singaporeans should pay attention to the Middle East, what would that sentence be?
You asked Chun Sing that question. What was his answer? In the spirit of cabinet solidarity, our answers cannot be too different. A Ouija board, oh dear. One sentence. Does it have to be grammatically correct? No. Okay, then I'll just offer energy, Islam, trade.
With that as the frame, I invite you to ask your questions. Please identify yourself and then ask your question. Anthony?
I think it was a great speech. And you come from a small school, which also produced some great people, like Obunui from Outram.
I went to the kindergarten. I think he went to the secondary school.
Say Singaporeans, we, the parents, are so keen to get to all the branded schools. And we ignore these schools, Outram or whatever it is, which have produced the Singaporean. I think if you can expand this message, I think that would be very useful. Thank you.
They got nothing to do in Middle East, right?
I don't think so.
Thank you, Anthony. That is why I subtly disguise such messages in all my speeches, including this one on the Middle East. Thank you very much for that.
Sikata-san.
Thank you very much, Minister. Let me ask you one question about ASEAN Charter. It says the respect for different cultures, religions, and languages. And also it says no interference. But when we get along Middle East, there seems to be some disputes among religions, languages, and so on. So how is ASEAN or in Singapore getting along with such problems from now along the way?
I think every region, geography and history is destiny and sort of define your historical DNA. So we are different from Europe, from the US, from Middle East, and from China or India. Everyone you trace back long enough in history, there's a certain reason why the construct of that region become the way it is. EU could only exist because it has a long history of Christianity. America, I believe, will continue to be an innovation powerhouse of the world because it keeps taking waves and waves of immigration from day one, right? Likewise, Middle East have a certain history, politics, and the geography defines that. Southeast Asia is unique in our own way because we straddle between big continents, and trade has no other choice, no other routes than go through Southeast Asia, which means surgeons to come to Singapore, to Southeast Asia and Singapore. And it took some time to settle here. And I think there is an instinctive, it's instinctive among Southeast Asians to know that in this region, we do need trade to survive. We need an open architecture, global architecture, in order to do well. And because instinctively we understand that, therefore there has to be a respect for different cultures, different religions. And along with that, it follows that you are restrained in terms of interference. So I think this is very deep in our DNA as a region. This year is our bicentennial celebration in Singapore, and we hope that through this process we dig a bit deeper about who we are, our cultural DNA, and I think it will be good for the soul, for the country.
Okay. Aaron?
Minister, you're following your colleague, the transportation minister, was an outstanding speech. And
It was a trade and industry.
trade industry. And the question I want to ask you is, while Singapore can offer so much to the Belt and Road countries, especially to Central Asia, in education, there's a huge deficit in Central Asia. Some countries are doing more, like Kazakhstan, with Nazarbayev University and others. Some countries don't have the resources to do as much. But what can Singapore offer, both here at the home base and also offering programs there in situ in Central Asia? Do you have any ideas and any practical projects that you can tell us about? Thank you.
Yeah. It reminds me of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. They have a campus in Kazakhstan. And I always ask them, do you have enough academics to send there? So I think we have a few academics permanently based there. But so that example reflects the dilemma we have. While we want to help as many countries as we can, but we are also quite limited in size and resources. I think the best way for Singapore to play a part and to contribute to education internationally is, first, we actually steal ideas from all over the world. Singapore's education system today is at a fairly high standard, well respected by the world, not because education ministers wake up and brilliant ideas are hatched, and then we implement them. Most of the time, we copy what other countries have done, what other cities have done, and we absorb them, adapt them to our circumstances, and we try to implement them well. And when we implement them well, then I think in terms of contribution back, keep our ideas open and let everyone who wish to adopt them for their own countries do so. A good example is our mathematics syllabus. Yeah, I got a letter from the Argentinian education minister one day to say, can you do a video to praise our mathematics syllabus? I say, why are you asking me to do that? He said, because we are adopting the Singapore syllabus. So I duly oblige. But it's open source. So it's open source, our system is open source, anyone can adopt it and improve upon it, and then we will learn in turn from countries which have come out with Mark 2, Mark 3 or Mark 4. And that's how we constantly improve ourselves.
I like your optimism. You spoke about US-China relations. In the spirit of optimism, you mentioned
To be a politician, you must be optimistic.
you mentioned about ASEAN and the success. So, in an optimistic note, what do you think can be possible in the Middle East in terms of being a similar organization like ASEAN? And what are there any, if you're on a less optimistic note, are there any black swans around within the horizon? And on an optimistic note, to our friends who asked about Middle East in the textbook, I think the publisher friend is actually going to Jordan this month to share about Singapore map.
Black swans are always there, and I talked about 3 of them. US-China relations, notwithstanding, I'm optimistic that it won't go to war and they will find a modus vivendi. Things can also go wrong and can never be taken for granted. Energy, how it evolves and how that will affect Middle East, that can also be a black swan. And finally, politics. All of us will have to make democracy work, which is still the best system known to us. We are not in a position to prescribe what the Middle East should do. It has a different historical and geographical DNA. But I think always, that is why we have the MEI, so that it can take all these questions that we have and study it and give us the answer. But I think it's always useful for any region in the world. Look at, of course, there are many things happening in the region. It's a diverse area. But look at the big trends underneath. And I think it's always about the tension between Shiites and Sunnis, Persian versus Arab, Saudi Arabia versus Iran, however you want to put it. How big powers are engaged in the region and how they shape the region, the future development and evolution of energy, future evolution of politics and ground-up sentiments. So watch all these major factors, and I hope MEI will give us answers in time to come.
Over there.
Good day, my name is Iskander Akalbayev and I'm coming from Kazakhstan. It was rightly mentioned by the Professor Cohen about the initiatives at Nazarbayev University. My question is about digital transformation and how Singapore actually adapted the system and kind of paving the way as a model for Asian countries. We're talking about opportunities that digital transformations is bringing to the table. What are the challenges and how you see the future development of digital transformation in sphere of education and foreign policy, for example? And what are your recommendations for young generation? What skills they need to polish in order to be kind of on the market in 5-10 years?
The challenge of digital transformation does not lie with the young. The young grows up with it. They are digital natives. And even if you don't put them through a coding course or IT course, and frankly, not everyone needs to be a coder. We just need to be able to use digital technology and use it well to make our work better. I think the young doesn't have a problem with that at all. Yeah. And even if they don't go through a formal education in IT, they will know how to use it. And they teach amongst themselves. So Of course, we try to accelerate the process and prepare them better through changes in our curriculum, and we have quietly made many changes in our school curriculum, including in the universities. The challenge of digital transformation lies with the not young. Yeah. And that is I think I belong to that group too. Because for you to move forward, leverage on this whole new technology, transform your economy, you got to bring everyone along. I think the success of the Singapore model so far lies in its ability for everyone to benefit. That growth is inclusive. I've shown this data in Parliament before, that every time we grow, our Gini coefficient drop. In 1997, we have a dip in economic performance because of Asian financial crisis. Gini coefficient shot up. No, 2008 global financial crisis, we were hit. Gini coefficient shot up. But then we grew again. Gini coefficient dropped. So we have to continually come up with growth models that bring the whole economy, everyone along. Digital transformation and digital revolution makes that a lot harder. How are we going to educate existing workforce to be able to use technology? It is therefore why Skills Future become a central national movement, central national policy for, I think, the foreseeable future. So it's not just about the school system or the education system, but the ability to train and prepare an entire workforce. And so therefore, one of the first things we do, we took workers training out of Ministry of Manpower and put it under education. So education has to be seen as a continuation, that when you leave school, we must prepare you for the next stage. And part of it is to catch up with technology.
I thought I saw a hand somewhere over there at the back. So, no? Oh, okay, I must be hallucinating. Okay. Any other question?
What rules are we under? We are under Chatham House, no recording?
Sorry, it's open.
Oh, totally open. Okay, okay.
Don't worry, don't worry. You said all the
We have a number of colleagues who and one of the important things they are doing is they are starting up area studies, doubling down on area studies. They have new centers to understand different parts of the world. Now, in the sense, as everyone has said, it is very important for Singaporeans to understand the rest of the world. Could I ask you, as Minister of Education, what has been and what is Singapore's plans or ideas going forward in terms of training students for regional expertise for different parts of the world?
This is one of the things that I worry about day in, day out. On one hand, I think sometimes Singaporeans undersell ourselves. We underestimated ourselves. That actually we are very global-minded as a people. And that goes back to history, geography, and who we are. You know, everything when we move around Singapore, we see cultures from everywhere. We use products that's from different parts of the world. So actually, compared to certain countries where people don't even have passports and do not see the need for passports, we are actually very open-minded. On the other hand, I think our knowledge of the region and the world can be deeper. And that, I think, may well be an important competitive advantage. So therefore, I'm always not a fan of saying that because there's digital transformation, therefore IT is the most important thing to be taught. But actually, one of the most important things that we need to teach our children today is to have a regional, global mindset. Yeah. So in schools, in universities, curriculum has changed a big deal. SMU, for example, you can't graduate today without having an overseas stint, whether it's an immersion program or you do a community immersion or do some social work overseas. Many of them goes to Cambodia and around Southeast Asia. And like NUS have a NUS overseas college system, exchanges with different cities around the world, so that we send our students for overseas attachment in startups. So not just overseas exposure, overseas startup exposures. We're going to see a lot more of this. And thirdly, what is important is actually language. We have benefited a great deal from having a mother tongue language policy. So English as our working language, but learn your mother tongue. Actually, we should promote it even more. Learn a third language, even at a conversational level if we can. Learn a third language of your fellow men or women, or learn a third language that is an ASEAN language. And I think all this, in the universities, I notice you have promoted learning of languages. Korean somehow is very popular. Yeah. But certainly ASEAN languages can be very useful. Yeah. I think language is a window to the culture, to the way of life, and the more you know languages, the greater you can operate in the region. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for two more questions. Professor Starr has already put up his hand. Take that question, and then we have a final question.
Thank you very much for really most impressive and practical presentation. My question pertains to the title above us here, both with regard to education and foreign affairs. The concept of the Middle East. Maybe you are operating on a maritime definition, but if you're not, then it seems to me you're preserving a definition of the Middle East that basically is a result of the Soviet Union, which separated Central Asia off from the Middle East and that cultural zone. But in terms of energy, in terms of Islam, which is really as much as centered in Central Asia as in the Middle East, in terms of your own definitions, except transport, sea transport, why not redefine it in broader terms and enrich your education thereby?
Thank you. I think I just have to answer yes, right? I did mention trade as my last point, and I probably subconsciously arranged it in that order: energy, Islam, trade. Actually, I was just talking to Bilahari. When Stanford Raffles first came to Singapore, he wanted Singapore as a free port and therefore needed traders, and his first target were the Middle East Arab traders, yeah, which today their names continue to be named around Singapore. So I agree. We should think in terms of trade, transport, because that's how Islam come to this region in the first place.
Okay, somebody had a question. Oh, yeah. Okay. That's the final question.
Mr. Jaffrey. My question is about trade and investment. In fact, we've done a lot of trade agreements, double taxation agreements between Middle East, China, Singapore. What do you think are reasons why flows have not changed so much? And is there anything that we can do in terms of the architecture that the trade and investment flows can improve?
What do you mean by flows have not
Flows, trading flows between the Middle East and Singapore, trading flows between Singapore, Middle East, and China, for example.
We have a FTA with GC, but there's no more GCC.
You know, free trade agreements is a piece of paper or a thick ream of paper, and it provides the rules and the facilitation for more trade and more investments. But in the end, enterprises have to make use of that. And whether enterprises make full use of a trade agreement, I think depends on many other factors. The investment environment between the two partners, non-tariff barriers, which increasingly becomes important, protection of intellectual property becomes important, cultural affinity, whether people between the two partners are comfortable operating in the other country, going back to the question that was raised about language and culture and then overseas exposure. So from your question, if we have not fully made use of the free trade agreement we have with the GCC, however effective it is, I think these are things that we then have to look at. Yeah. We have the MTI Deputy Secretary of Trade here, so I'm sure he got the message, yeah, from me and from his minister. And I think the deeper we understand the country, the better it is. It's just like observations that's always made. between Singapore and New York, and between Singapore and say Rio or Sao Paulo, is actually about the same distance. But trade, investments, exchanges are such a big difference between Sing New York versus Sing Sao Paulo. Yeah, and really the barrier, other than the fact that we don't have an FTA with Brazil, but other than that is that whole cultural barrier. And the more we can break it down through better understanding, the better it will be.
Thank you, Minister. I should, before I ask you to join me in thanking him, reveal that he was once in a different incarnation a trade negotiator. Anyway, please join me to thank the Minister.